What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. Pretty recently, I swapped out my old Technics SAEX 110 for a new receiver, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't feel some sense of nostalgia about the role that this quiet workhorse has played in my listening experience over the past 5 or 6 years. So I thought, what better way to give this old guy a proper send-off than to reflect back on some of the memories of listening to music that this thing facilitated. Obviously, this thing is nothing too special, but prior to having this receiver, I had, I think, an old Pioneer that had some electrical problems that would cause one of my speakers to kind of be a little bit quieter from time to time. So really upgrading to this thing, even though it's kind of a mass market gear from the late 80s or early 90s, it really made a big difference in my listening experience. So I just want to take a look at a handful of albums that I remember appreciating distinctly because I had a decent setup. Now, one thing I want to establish before I get into this is that I am not an audiophile. If I spent the rest of my life never talking about audio gear, I'd be more than happy. In fact, I would have continued to use this receiver forever if not for the fact that a substantial upgrade basically just fell into my lap. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that you don't need incredible gear to enjoy listening to records. I don't think this was a particularly expensive piece of gear in its time, but it got the job done, and even 30 years later, this thing is still kicking. So one of the first albums that I remember really appreciating having the punch of this Technics for was The Question by Emery. Now, this is a reissue of an album from 2004 that I happen to think is very close to perfect. We used to use the E word as a bit of a pejorative back in the day, but this is probably a genre-defining work for emo-core. I remember when this album finally came out on vinyl, and I snagged a copy, took it home, dropped it on the turntable, and cranked this bad boy up. And it just hit harder than it ever had. And I just had a great time listening to this record. And even before all of that, this receiver brought me through a really important musical rite of passage, I guess, for someone who collects vinyl when they get married. My wife had a handful of records, and when we got married, I went through the process of sorting her stuff into the shelves. And I remember even reflecting at the time on how us merging our music together was kind of symbolic in the way that her music and my music coming together sort of changed the characteristics of this collection as some sort of cultural artifact. Our relationship was like merging two people's histories together in order to create a new one, right? And a future, to forge a new story together. And so one of the records that was a part of her collection that remains in the shelves is Haim's Days Are Gone. I've kind of fallen off a little bit, but this album kind of marks a moment in time for us. And of course, there the Technics was quietly, or perhaps not so quietly, just bringing it. Another thing that was always important for my wife and I was to have a space where we could bring people in, where we could invite our friends over and socialize. And so often music facilitates the social aspect of our lives. It may not have been front and center, but it was good to know that we had the gear, we had a setup where we could put something on and enjoy spending time with our friends. And one album that ended up on a lot of our social playlists in that time was Taiko's Epoch. I love Taiko. It's such chill music. It's such unassuming music, but it's still rich and textured. It's the sort of thing that you can put on in a social setting and forget about. And of course, I mean that as no insult to this album. It's equally worth sitting down and giving this thing a close listen because it's so carefully crafted. It's textured. There's a lot going on in here that's worth examining. It just speaks to the versatility of Taiko's sound, that it kind of functions in both spaces. You know, there are a lot of albums that I would never put on in a social situation. You know, we're not listening to Close to the Edge by Yes because there's just way too much going on for that album to be the soundtrack to a good conversation with a friend. This, however, works totally. And of course, this receiver was around when I first started getting into jazz music, and I picked up my first ever jazz album, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. It was the thing powering my system when I put on Kamasi Washington's Harmony of Difference for my, at the time, 5-month-old daughter. And she just freaked out hearing this thing. The look on her face of excitement was something that I will never forget. That is a moment that is etched into my memory for eternity. All made possible by this old thing. One of my favorite stories, brought to you by this old Technics receiver, happened in the first apartment where my wife and I lived after we got married. We had great neighbors. They were awesome people. I loved living there. We both did. It was a great time in our lives. But our upstairs neighbor was occasionally not too crazy about us listening to music very loudly. You know, we used to get these text messages that would say, "Hey, I'm hearing the low-end reverberations through the walls," which is weird, but understandable. I mean, we lived in pretty close proximity to one another. I'll never forget picking up this old compact King Crimson compilation, which, you know, is nothing special, but I love King Crimson, so I got this thing. I throw it on the turntable. I'm listening through side one. I hear Discipline. We're deep into Thela Hun Ginjit, and I hear a little knock on the door, and there's our upstairs neighbor asking us politely if we wouldn't mind turning the music down. And of course, this was by no means the only time that this ever happened. We fairly regularly got texts, and of course, that always put a little bit of a cloud over my listening experience while we lived in this apartment, because I never felt like I could really let this thing off the chains. It always felt like this thing had more to give than there was space for. Once we finally got our own house, being able to listen to music as loud as I want to, as loud as this thing is capable of doing, ended up being a real source of joy. It's been a lot of fun to have a decent system. You don't need a lot, you just need enough. And this thing got the job done. And that takes us up to quite recently. And I've been on this little journey to get the most out of the gear that I have. Not because I was dissatisfied with it, but just because I wanted to listen to the music that I have in the best way possible. And when Russ from Mama's Records came over and we set up my speakers and we went through this whole process of placing the speakers in the space properly, it was this thing that powered that moment. The moment where I heard music in a way that I had never heard before. And I think we put on Yes is Fragile. And of course, this album begins with Roundabout, which is a real sonic tour de force. That song opens with this really quiet but swelling sound that ends with these guitar harmonics. And I will never forget sitting in the exact center of my couch with those Pinnacle Gold reference speakers placed just properly in the room and hearing that sound kick in. I cried. I had heard this music in a way that I never had before. That moment brought to you by the Technics SAEX 110. And I know it's kind of silly to wax poetic about some piece of electronic gear, but look, I'm grateful. I've had so much fun listening to music, and this thing was there. It could have been something else. It could have been something worse. It could have been something better. But this was the thing that was there, and I was content with it. I was happy with it. And now I have something that's noticeably better. That will be the silent workhorse for the next several years, maybe forever, of my listening enjoyment. I would love to hear from you guys. Feel free to drop into the comments section below and let me know of a time where you distinctly remember being thankful for a piece of audio gear because it was the necessary component in some musical experience that you had. And guys, that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you subscribe. And if you're really interested in what I'm doing over here on this channel, I'm going to put a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty cool medium quality merch. Until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.